he unfortunately, as the lead man in this element, struck a big improvised explosive device, and the whole compound rocked. It was a big device, and it was a bit eerie in that the entire village went quiet. The gunfight stopped. Everything went dead quiet. There was this massive blast, this huge plume of dust and smoke, and everything went silent. Then everything resumed, and the radios came to life with trying to get information. And I started to grab my med kit. I'd been up on the roof shooting through a little keyhole there, trying to sort of suppress this enemy position with another guy. And I raced down, got my kit on, waited for the call, and sure enough, got this call through that we had some critically injured casualties.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served war zone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today you hear the combat story of Dr. Dan Pronk, a former Australian SAS doctor who completed 4 tours in Afghanistan. Do not be fooled by the doctor title. Dan was on the front lines conducting hundreds of operations with the elite SAS. This is the first of 2 interviews with Dan. Since leaving the military, Dan has gone on to an executive role in medical management, as well as co-owning the multimillion-dollar company TacMed Australia and founding several entrepreneurial startups. He's written 2 books, Average 70-Kilogram Dickhead, Motivational Lessons from an Ex-Army Special Forces Doctor, and Arterial Tourniquets for police officers, law enforcement, and other first responders. He just released a 3rd book with 2 fellow former SAS operators called Resilience Shield. Dan was referred to me by another SAS leader as a legend in the community, and I hope you enjoy this first of 2 combat story rounds with Dan as much as I did. As a note, the connection is somewhat spotty at parts given the US to Australia connection, but it's well worth it. Enjoy. Dan, welcome to the show, and thanks for taking the time to share your story with us.
Ryan, it's an absolute privilege to be on the show, mate. Thank you for the opportunity.
I want to start out with obviously just talking about your book, which has one of the best names ever, the Average 70-Kilogram Dickhead. But because many of the Americans listening won't know the conversion, it's about 154 pounds by my math. Right.
So that didn't have the same ring to it. 154-pound Dickhead was a bit cumbersome for the title. So yeah.
So now that we're all on the same page, we'll get into the book and a lot of your experiences, but I think the way that I read that book, you were such an optimist and full of life, but it really talks about you having this mediocre, average upbringing before maybe this other part of your life. And you talk about growing up in Australia where you went to 7 schools and actually got expelled from one. So I wanted to start with what was it like as a kid, and what happened in school that made you feel like this was just an average upbringing?
Well, I think the point of that book was just to try and distill down a few lessons learned and just trying to get them out there in a comical fashion. But just, it was a bit of a reflection that I'd gone along and on paper, by the time I sat down to write that, it looked like I read well on paper. I looked at my CV and I thought, gee, that looks like an incredibly average bloke in reality. And what I wanted to do was just, in a way, distill that down and just maybe demystify some of I think social media is terrible at putting up these 1-minute snapshots of excellence, and people look at that and they think that's completely unattainable, because from where they are in life to looking at what they want to achieve, it seems like too much of a leap. But when I reflected back on some of the stuff that I'd had the opportunity to be a part of, to go to medical school, become a doctor, to get into the army and get into special operations, deployment operations, there was no secret sauce there. There was no magic. It was just, well, set a goal, have a clear direction, and chip away at it slowly. You don't need to be superhuman. So the whole premise behind the Average 70-Kilo Dickhead, and the story behind that title is at the start of the book there, where that term came from. But it's just, that's what I am. I weigh about 70 kilos, had an average upbringing. It's certainly not a story of coming from this horrendous, it's not a David Goggins type terrible upbringing and doing something remarkable despite all odds. I had a stable family unit. We moved around. I was average at school. a small bloke at 175 centimeters. I don't know what that's, 5'8", 10. I don't know in inches. I don't do those conversions.
I don't know either.
No, average height, probably below average height, below average weight, average intelligence, but had the tools, had the basic building blocks enough to start the pathway to do things that may be perceived as above average. And so that was the whole premise of that, is that pretty much anyone with the basic tools can get out and do exceptional things. And the difference is just that having clear goals and then just chipping away at them slowly but surely, moving in that direction. You won't always hit them, but just having a goal to move towards is going to end you up in a better spot than not.
Yeah. And I will say a lot of the guys who I've interviewed who come from these higher tier units have this ambition that you see where they're trying to climb the next highest mountain. As you exit the military, I know we'll get into this later, but all the work you do, you're almost like a serial entrepreneur. There's so much that you're working on. Was that you as a kid as well? Were you busy like that, trying to do all these different things?
No, it really wasn't. I grew up in an army family, which accounts for why I went to so many schools. And I think that the tally was 10 from memory. It was a lot of schools anyway. But at that point, I had a brother, and he went into the army as well and ended up having a very distinguished career with special operations, commanded the SAS regiment here in Australia. But so I guess as a kid, you don't have any basis for comparison. You are just a kid, that's your normal. And so we moved around every few years and we changed schools. And as a part of that, on reflection, it meant that I didn't really ever make any strong friendships throughout school. I've got no lifelong friends, but so there was a downside. Like I said, at the time, it was my normal, so I didn't know any different. But what it also meant was you had to get in and you had to assimilate quickly and fit into the routine, and you had to adapt and you had to just get on with things. And so I think it generated a degree of resilience out of necessity. And it also allowed me exposure to a whole bunch of different environments that I had to adapt to pretty quickly with hindsight. And so that was my schooling. That I did get booted out of one school. And looking back there, that was one of the high schools I went to. I was just a little bit of a fish out of water, really. It was an all-boys, fairly old English style private school. And I didn't fit. And when I reflect on that, and I have a fair bit, I think at that stage I had a bit of a rebellious streak, and it was nothing too dramatic, but I just was I didn't fit the mold, and I was starting to realize that I didn't want to comply with these rules that I thought were pretty arbitrary that they were imposing on me. I didn't want to play the sports that were revered at that school. Like actually when I was at school, I was a little chubby kid. So I was a short, chubby kid. I wasn't going to play football. I would have got crumped. So, and it was a footballer's school. And so, I didn't fit there. I wasn't particularly academic. I was more artistic, and art wasn't really considered important in that school. And so I just didn't really fit in. And so I had not a great time there. And that ended up just culminating in them booting me out. And I ended up finishing up my schooling at a school that really did appreciate those things and allowed people to be more themselves. And so thankfully, I ended up not thriving, but having a great time in my final, I guess thriving, I'd call it thriving. I didn't do academically well, but I fit in. I was accepted in that last school. And at around that point, my last couple of years of school, I started to be very interested in middle distance running and started to show some promise there. So it was my last 2 years of school were really a really positive experience for me. But yeah, there was a bit of a kind of convoluted and rocky road to get there. So
I also went to a school like that in Southern Africa for 4 years for elementary school. So it was a British boarding school. So like uniforms, rugby was the sport there, swimming. They could hit you, like the teachers could hit you, which was, was that like, I was going to ask if it was the same there.
Oh, we got whaled. Yeah, I'd regularly get caned, and I would bring it on. I would induce it myself at times. It was this weird, I don't know if it was a bad, the teachers had a miniature cricket bat that he'd whale us with, that'd leave a bruise, across the entire sort of length of your bum. And I think if you're looking like that, I would be right back up there. But yeah, it was just how it was at the time. It sounds like you had a similar experience, right?
Yeah, that's true. And actually, there are days where I think there's no way they had a cricket bat. Like I remember them hitting us with a cricket bat, but thinking they could never do that. Like I'm almost convincing myself it didn't happen. Yeah. So it's really funny when you mention that because I recall that vividly. Yeah. Hey, you mentioned the military family, right? And a brother who also goes into SAS. Can you talk about the military background, your parents, extended family? What was that like?
Well, my old man, like you, was an Army helicopter pilot. So he had gone through junior ranks as a junior soldier. He'd driving tanks. He sort of came into that role at the tail end of Vietnam, missed Vietnam, and then went back and did officer training and moved into flying helicopters. And he ended up a commanding officer of a aviation regiment. And so had a really, with hindsight, distinguished career in the military. And he was. It's funny, you don't know as a kid, you just see him as your dad. And then it was only when my brother and I started to enter the Army and meet people who had worked with or under the command of my dad that we got this other impression of him as a person. But yeah, we had so growing up, my brother the writing was on the wall. He was going to be military from the earliest age. He loved it. He did his Army cadets, pretty much every childhood photo. He used to have this plastic AR-15, and it's in every childhood photo. Pretty much, my brother Ben is just this chubby little kid packing heat in every family photo. It's weird, but and I don't know if it was because of that I chose to go a completely different path and grow my hair long and have dreadlocks and earrings and all those sort of things. But until I was 23, the thought never crossed my mind that I would join the Army. Never. I was adamant. And I remember going to my brother's graduation parades at officer school here in Australia at the Royal Military College, and hair down to my shoulders, earring in. I was doing a lot of triathlon by that point, so shaved legs and reflective sunglasses, and watching these people in uniform, clean cut, marching around, thinking this is ridiculous. And then not 5 years after that, I found myself on that same parade ground. So it's funny how life goes.
You mentioned you didn't know why you didn't go that direction. Could you give any more flavor? Like, was it rebellious against your dad? Is this your older brother or young? I'm assuming you're second.
Older brother. Yeah.
So I have three boys like you do. I think you have three boys.
Yeah.
Do they have the same personalities as like you and your older brother? And
they're their own people. Yeah. The middle guy is probably most like me.
Yeah.
He's got a couple of just mildly sociopathic traits, which I think will get him in trouble, but also be very protective. But yeah, they are, they're their own people, and they're heading in very different directions, which is incredible because, like your kids, like myself and my brother, you get the same nature, the same nurture, and yet you develop into your own person. But I look back and I think I was never rebelling against my dad. There was none of that. He was super supportive, and there was never any pressure at all from him for us to join the military. It just simply was not there in the slightest. And he was very what's the right word? But he was very supportive of us. He gave us a lot of space to develop into our own people. He was very tolerant, I think, is the word. And I look back, and here I was as this punk little kid getting in trouble at school. He's running an Army aviation regiment, and I'm getting in strife. And there was never any kickback from that. He was always supportive, trying to help me through that. There was the appropriate discipline from a parent, but it was never any of this regimented military type lifestyle at home. That's for sure. And geez, some of the haircuts I got. Once again, I look back at family photos, and I'm there with these horrid undercut haircuts and this greasy teenage hair hanging down over the top. And my old man must have been cringing, but he never said anything.
Wow.
To one human being. But yeah, so I don't think there was ever any rebellion. I as a person, I didn't really fit that mold, and so wanted to go in a different direction. And then I found triathlon and thought that I might want to give that a crack and see if I could make a crust out of being a professional athlete. And so I just sort of evolved down a different pathway, not out of rebellion, just out of that was who I seemed to be.
Yeah. So just before we get to the triathlon part of your life, is it fair to say, as you were growing up, did you become a motorhead, petrol head? I don't know what it's called in Australia,
Yeah.
but I know you become one later. Was that something early on you got into?
Yeah, it was. And that was Dad. So Dad was a car guy. He always had a sports car as we were growing up. And then there was always multiple carcasses of cars just littering our backyard, much to my mum's disgust. And then I've inflicted the same thing on my poor, long-suffering wife. Oftentimes, her nice car's out on the street because I've got 3 pieces of crap sitting in the garage. But so he was a car guy. We grew up, my brother and I, under cars. What we thought was helping the old man out, with hindsight, really wasn't. But it was quality time with Dad, mostly holding a torch and getting yelled at with your head stuck in an engine bay. But so it was infused into us from our youth, that the love of cars. And then as soon as I reached an age where I could get my license, my dad and I went and bought a British car called a Triumph 2500, real piece of crap. But these were my first cars. And I remember that my first car cost $1,250. I remember that vividly. And that's mid-1990s, so it's probably a little bit more now, but not much more. And we didn't get one, we got 2, and then we tore them all apart and put together one decent car, rebuilt the engine and all the parts. So it was a fantastic experience with my dad. After that, my dad had once again a Triumph, an old British convertible Triumph called a Triumph Stag. And so this thing, he'd had it when we were kids. And so we grew up belting around in this, cramped in the back, tiny back seats of this Triumph Stag, often with the roof down when in the middle of winter and we were freezing our asses off. But this was our childhood car, and it was up on blocks in the garage. And the second I started drawing a wage from the army, I bought it from Dad and built a new engine for it. And so that was my first sports car. And then that evolved into, an old Lamborghini. Once again, the second I could almost afford it, I went and bought that.
Don't tell that story yet, because I really want to dig into that one. That's like a life lesson on so many levels that
there's a lot to learn from that.
Oh man. No, that's great. Actually, a big regret of mine is not being more handy on a vehicle. Like, I just didn't grow up working on cars. My dad kind of did, but by the time I got to flight school, they open up the Apache and they're like, here's the engine. And like, I've never even really seen a car engine before. So you have to learn, as a pilot, you have to learn all about how the fuel works and where the oil's going. And in case something goes wrong, you got to really understand it. I was at such a disadvantage from the start there. And I just regret not doing more with cars. So it's real cool. I want to make sure we get into that later too.
Oh, but man, what a magic machine to learn on.
Yeah.
Really basic those Apaches are.
Yeah, the first engine you see shouldn't be a Rolls-Royce engine. I feel like it should be the Triumph engine.
It should be a crappy little 80 horsepower. Yeah, exactly. Not a gazillion horsepower thing hanging off a gunship.
No. Okay, so you've mentioned a couple times your role into being a professional triathlete. Can you talk through that? Because you just mentioned, like, you grew up this chubby kid. You're small, undersized, but clearly kind of the end of high school, that changes, right? And you find this almost a passion. If you could talk us through that.
Yeah, I think the term professional triathlete is pretty grandiose for what I ended up being there, Ryan. I can't take that one. But that was certainly my goal. And I can't remember exactly how I got into running, but I did. And it was at a point where I was having those troubles at school, late teenage years. I had started running. I don't even know why. I think it was probably a bit of a peer pressure. I think I was copping a bit of heat for being fat, and running was a solution to sort that out. It was at an age where I started to get a bit more interested in what girls thought of me. And probably with hindsight, like I said, I don't remember the catalyst, but I started running and I loved it. It was, for me, it was just a release, an immediate release. And I have, with hindsight, been a person that since my teenage years has has been a bit of an all or nothing kind of guy. I like to, for whatever reason, push myself and try and push limits and try and improve myself. And that's only amplified as I've gotten older. But I just found running to be an absolute release, a great, just, it made me feel fantastic. And I found that I could push myself to this point. And I'd often, when I really got into it, I'd often train till I vomited, train till I collapsed. Like I would push myself to these limits. And I look back and I sort of think of that as it's not too much different to a bunch of these other forms of release, these which are considered, far more maladaptive. The self-harming type sort of situations where people will maybe cut or burn themselves to get that feeling of release or feeling alive. And I got that through running. So, I mean, that was brilliant. And it was at a time when a lot of the people who I chose to hang out with, because from a personality and a cultural perspective, the people I enjoyed hanging around with were the ones that gravitated into drug use. And so with retrospect, at an age where they were heading down that pathway to get a buzz, I was getting that buzz from my running. And it just got fueled by the fact that it was such a positive thing. And I started to win races. I started to, win the school cross country when I was a couple of grades below people I was racing against. And so it got positively reinforced. It really gave me a lot of self-esteem and confidence. And so it was all these things wound into one. And it was quite a kind of dichotomous existence, if you like, in that I was hanging out with all these people that were smoking weed and starting to pop pills, and a couple of them progressed, unfortunately, down the hard drug use pathway. These were the people that I felt I associated with, but the sporting side of things.
So you mentioned something there that I picked up quite a bit in the book. You said, you set a goal to do this triathlon work. And I think you seem, at least, to set these goals pretty specifically, like what you're going to go out and do. Was there something there for you? Like, all right, I'm going to get into this, but I'm going to do it full on for real. My goal is to get, I don't know, like to compete professionally and have a paycheck from this. What was the goal for you as you started out there?
I think, from memory, if it wasn't initially, it certainly evolved into it, and I fell hopelessly short of it. Let's be clear here. But triathlon was becoming an Olympic sport in the year 2000, and so I remember seeing that at a time when I was 17 years old, maybe just getting out of school, starting to show. Triathlon was pretty new at that point. It was a bit of a fledgling sport, and I'd swum at a decent level as a kid. I'd got myself a bike and gotten into some cycling as a bit of a cross-training thing for my running. I was a keen middle distance runner, so 1500s and miles was the distance I loved to run. And so I'd started doing a bit of cycling as cross-training and low-impact training for the running, and picked the swimming back up, went and did a few triathlons as a junior kid, and did all right. And once again, that started to just perpetuate that desire to get better. And it was at that time that triathlon started to take off a little bit. It flagged on the Olympic radar, and I was showing a little bit of promise as a junior athlete. And so somewhere in all of that, and also I wasn't very academic at school. I was good enough, but not great, not that interested, but I was very interested in the sporting side. And so somewhere in there, I thought, let's give this thing a nudge. And I didn't really want to go straight to university out of school. And so, and my dad, once again, my parents encouraged us to take a year off. Both my brother and I did that between school and university. And so that was an opportunity for me to really knuckle down, start training, and try and have a go at this professional triathlon thing.
And you do more than just try to have a go. I mean, this is like 5 or 6 years, isn't it, that you're working?
Yeah, it was. It ended up being, to put context on that, I did end up going to uni. So I took a year off and did a variety of other things. But the backbone of that year was training pretty much full-time, and then racing as a triathlete. My parents from there kind of said, hey, you got to have a fallback plan, as many parents would. I understand that. And so we reached this compromise where they helped fund me to move to the Gold Coast in Australia, in Queensland, which was pretty much the epicenter of certainly triathlon in Australia, and a lot of high-level international athletes would come and train. So I moved to the Gold Coast and managed to maneuver myself into this elite training squad down there.
I'm sorry, hold on, Dan. Can you just say how you maneuver? You make it sound like you kind of just, it's interesting how you got in, how you break into this group. I mean, could you just?
Yeah. So I knew this was where I wanted to be. So I very deliberately moved my life to the Gold Coast on Australia and started an exercise science degree. So I did that part-time. That was the deal. My parents said, right, we will support your triathlon aspirations, but you got to study. And I had an aunt who's passed away now, but she also helped me. So I mean, God bless Aunt Mary. I used to laugh that I was sponsored by Aunt Mary Racing, AMR, and she was just a fantastic human being that was really selflessly helped me. But yeah, so I moved down the Gold Coast, and what I'd started doing was just turning up to the areas where this group was training, and just in the pool, I'd be in the lane next to them, just busting my ass, or I'd turn up at the running track if they were doing mile reps, and I'd do mile reps. I'd tag onto their crew, I'd do mile reps, and if I could beat a few of them, I'd beat a few of them, to the point where the coach ended up saying, "Oi, mate, come here. Who are you? And what do you keep doing turning up? And do you want to train with us?" And I'm like, "Yeah,
that's ballsy. That's a really cool story." Yeah.
Oh, cheers, man. Yeah, I didn't know any other strategy, and I figured that at a minimum, I could turn up, see what they were doing, and do it as well, because it's working for them, and get pretty much free training in effect just by turning up and being present.
That's awesome. Okay, so you move out there, and you've said you fell hopelessly short of it, referring to the professional side. Somewhere else I read that, I think in the book, actually, you say when that failed. And I just want to spend a moment on this. I mean, we're talking about like competing at an extremely high level. You did very well to kind of get yourself there. And then you're kind of up against people who are just extremely good. I've run into this as well. Like, do you look back and think of that as a failure for yourself, or just how do you wrap your head around it now with some hindsight?
Look, I think in unemotional terms, yes, it was a failure, because I had set my goal as being a professional triathlete, to make a living out of triathlon and to be competitive at an elite level. And I fell miserably short of that. In terms of, I don't see myself as a failure. I see that I failed at that goal. With hindsight, I think the key, the fundamental thing that prevented me from being the athlete that I probably could have been, which I don't know if that would have been enough to be elite. I suspect not, based on some of the people that just were genetically so superior to me. But the thing that I lacked at that time was the mindset. I was a quitter, plain and simple, a quitter. I had several races where if it wasn't going my way, I'd just stop. I'd go and collect my stuff and go home. And I look back just absolutely disgusted at that attitude, but that's how I was. And it took me, I looped back around, and then I think I probably put some of those demons to bed with the SAS selection course. I developed the grit and the determination by then. And I guess it's that, you can't put an old head on young shoulders type routine. Physically, I was not as impressive a specimen as some of the blokes I was racing against, but I think it was the psychological thing that really limited my performance there. But there were good days, some days that'd go well, and I'd race well and get a decent finish, but other days. And so there was no consistency. And I think that just plain and simple came down to the lack of psychological resilience at that age.
Do you think it had anything to do with the lack of interest in that? Because we'll get to the selection, but you outline a couple instances where, like many people during selection, like you're on the verge of quitting, if not for something else, but you keep going, when many people quite honestly do quit, but you decided not to quit there. Was it because you just had this passion to become, a member of the SAS, and you didn't have the same passion as you look back in triathlon, or was it something else? Maturity?
Yeah, I think I was very, probably another key factor is the professional triathlon thing, with hindsight, was probably very extrinsically motivated. I think I loved the idea of what other people would think of that, with all the prestige that came from that. Of, look, I used to buy the triathlon magazines. That was back before the internet, and these people that I held in really high esteem were in these magazines. They were getting interviewed, and I suspect I probably thought that was what the goal was, what that looked like. And that then, as I matured, I became far more intrinsically motivated. And by the time I hit the start line it wasn't about, if I said I didn't want to be part of that unit, or didn't want to be able to paint my rifle or grow a beard, or those trivial things that are shiny about special operations. But for me, it was about, can I do this? Is this something that I'm capable of? And if I really set this ambitious goal, can I go and do it? I wanted to push myself to beyond my physical and psychological preconceived limits. I was doing it for me, and I was focused on the process. I was focused on self-mastery, and just the end goal of joining the unit was, in my mind, just going to facilitate the opportunity to continue on that pathway of developing myself in that environment. And so, I think that was a big difference as well between when I was in my late teens, early 20s, to when I eventually got on selection in my early 30s, was that evolution from extrinsic motivation to that intrinsic motivation. And I've always, as an adult, had this fear of dying wondering, this reaching a point in my life where I look back and think, I wonder if I could have done that. That's probably, when I think about my greatest fears, that's probably it, getting to the end of my days and looking back thinking, I wish I had a go at that, or I wonder if I could have done X, Y, or Z. And so that was a big motivator as well. I knew that window for special forces would close, and I wanted to give it a crack. And I knew that the outcome was possibly completely outside of my control. All I could do was turn up, do my best, and if I got through, great. If they liked me, if they didn't, well, that's a tough pill to swallow, but at least I had a crack.
So if we transition now, you decide, all right, I'm not going to continue down this path as a triathlete. How do you find your way to the military at that point? And what's next? Because there's the doctor side, there's the Army side. What comes after the triathlete?
Yeah. So that was the year 2000. So that was the year that triathlon debuted as an Olympic sport. And as I said, I was nowhere near contention for that. But that year, so I'd finished my exercise science degree. I'd done that part-time over, I think it was about 4.5 years in the end. I'd chipped away at that in the background while I was focusing on sport, and finished that. And I'd done really quite well in that with hindsight. And looking at that, it was relevant. I got it. It was not like physics or maths or something that I saw no relevance to. I didn't see a utility of. But when I was doing exercise science, we were in the VO2 lab. We were learning biophysics, biochemistry, biomechanics, and it was all directly related to my passion of triathlon at the time. And so I engaged in it, and it was exciting for me. And as a byproduct of that, I did well. I loved it. And so I'd gotten decent grades in my exercise science degree, finished that up at the start of the year 2000, or end of 99. 2000, knuckled down to give the triathlon thing one last ditch attempt. So by then I was 23 years old, and got an Achilles tendon injury really early in that season. Didn't rupture the thing, but it badly strained it, and was pretty much written off for months of that season. And that was the final nail in the coffin. It was obvious that I wasn't going to be the athlete I wanted to be. There was a couple of brilliant junior triathletes coming through who were 4 or 5 years younger than me, and they were starting to beat me. And so I could see the writing on the wall that I wasn't going to get there. So I had a few months off with that injury. I'd done this sport, but didn't really want to work in that area. It was hard to get a job at that time as an exercise scientist. Started looking at what's next. The triathlon thing wasn't going to work out. It was obvious. I started to look at the Army. My brother had gone into the Army by that point, and I'd had that military upbringing. So that was a familiar thing to me. And that was the first time it started to look like a viable option as a potential career. And pretty much on a whim, I also sat the graduate Australian medical school's admission test, so the postgraduate medicine admission test. I had never thought of being a doctor in my entire life up until that point. My girlfriend at the time said, "Hey, why don't you sit this test?" I'm like, "What's that test?" And so she told me. I actually rang them. I got on the website. I reckon we had the internet by then, or rang them up, and they said, "Nah, look, sorry, admissions have closed." It was within 2 weeks of the test. And so I said, "Yeah, no, actually, I must have phoned them." And I said, "No worries, missed it, maybe next year," type thing. Hung up, and this girlfriend of mine at the time said, "No, phone them back and see if there's a late admission process." And so I did. And they said, yeah, if you pay an extra $200, you can sit the exam. And so I did it, went and did this test, and lo and behold, scored high enough to apply for medical school. I became aware, I think through my dad, that the Army had a scholarship scheme to that just purely as free money at the time. And so I had no other real options. I went and interviewed for med school, got myself in, went through this Army process and got myself in to that scholarship scheme. And the two came together, and the next year, 2001, I toddled off to med school on an Army scholarship.
Damn. All right. So you're going to med school. You're also in the Army. Can you take us through to actually, I don't want to pass over this. How hard was medical school for you? I mean, you talk about being an average student growing up, at least in the US, we think of medical school as being extremely difficult. How did you navigate that?
Look, it wasn't hard, and that's not because I'm more intelligent than, I don't have this elite level of intelligence. It's just it's a lot of work. It's no harder than any other university course, which I think is no harder than volume ramps up exponentially. And so there was, once again, the same principles and this, I love that mantra, always a little further. Just keep chipping away at the simple stuff. Like habitually do the simple stuff well, and you will excel in life, because most people couldn't be bothered because it's hard and it's not sexy and it's not shiny and it doesn't lead to these exponential, changes in you. But I didn't find medical school particularly challenging, to be honest, but it was a massive volume of work. It wasn't. And I think it's like special operations. I think we look at it from the outside thinking that's for exceptional people, and it's not, that. It's, the things you've done. I look at an Apache pilot and I think, my goodness, that's a remarkable job. I look at someone who works for an agency like Central Intelligence. I think that's remarkable. And but I'm sure that you would agree that these are average people who have the minimum sort of capabilities and just set a goal and work towards them. And so I think medicine's no different. But the problem, I think, is that the people who get the exceptional marks at school tend to go into medicine or law because they can, and then it creates this false impression that it is only for the higher intellects.
So I know it takes you a long time to get even into the selection process with SAS, but was that, as you're going through your medical training, you're going into the Army, did you know from the start, hey, I want to get to that unit for whatever reason?
No, that light bulb moment happened at the end of my first year of medical school. So I couldn't tell you if I was even really, well, I was aware because by that time my brother had gotten into the SAS and he was over there as a junior troop commander, so as a junior officer. And so I was aware of them, but I didn't care about special operations. It wasn't an aspiration of mine at all. Even at that point, I was in the Army because the Army was giving me free money to go study, and I had no other real options to fund my medical school. So it was just all this. It happened very quickly. I joined the Army, not because I wanted to, because it was the best option at the time. I did medicine, not because I'd ever thought about it before, but because I could, and I didn't have any other options, which sounds, I don't mean to, that sort of sounds a bit odd, and I don't mean to diminish, I know there's a lot of people that probably try and do both and can't get through, and I don't, the privilege of that opportunity is not lost on me, but the reality is these weren't long-term goals of mine. These were things that I fell ass backwards into when my other sort of life plan fell in a heap. But so I had no desire to join special operations at all until the end of 2001. And what happened there was I'd finished my first year of medical school. Of course, the September 11th attacks occurred in 2001, and my brother by that time had gone across to the SAS regiment, done selection, and was a troop commander there. And he was gearing up to go with one of Australia's very early pushes to Afghanistan to support that effort. And at the end of my first year of medical school, on my Christmas holidays, I went across to visit him to basically say goodbye before he went off on operations. And that was when I got a look at what the SAS did. I met a few of the guys. I went and toured the base and had a look at what went on. And actually in discussion with a couple of the operators that were in my brother's troop, one of them said to me, "Hey, look, you should do selection and come across to the unit." And I'm like, "Nah, man, I'm in the army to be a doctor." He says, "Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Come across as a qualified doctor." And I was like, yes, that is exactly what I'm going to do. It was this epiphany. And so that was end of 2001. And then it was 2008 before the stars aligned and I could get on the course.
Damn. All right. So in between, because I don't want to pass over that, I know that you tried to get into selection earlier. You kind of promised a slot and then it's taken away. I also need you to explain why doctors are going through selection. I don't know if that happens at Delta over here or in the British SAS, but all the doctors I knew, like they weren't going through the regular training in the US Army. So I need some explanation when we get there, but in between, what was going on for you? You kind of come out of medical school. What's the first role in the Army?
Yeah. So I did phone up after that. I was all sort of fired up, G'd up with this dream. And so as a second year med student, I'd never thrown the uniform on because pretty much the Army says, right, well done, you're a lieutenant in the Army. Now go get educated and come back when you're useful. And they don't have much contact in between. And so there is this period of time where they leave you alone. They pay you and they all the rest of it and look after you from an administrative perspective. But you don't do anything military because you got to go study. And so as a second year med student on this scholarship scheme, I phone up the Special Forces Training Centre who run all the selection courses and say to them, "Hey, look, I want to do SAS selection. Can I?" And they're like, no, you can't, you dickhead type thing. And no, they didn't say that at all. They were very supportive. They said, that's a great aspiration, but we wouldn't support it at this point, try back later. And so I harassed them a few times over the years when I was at med school and predictably got the same answer. But so I needed to finish my 4 years of postgraduate medicine. I needed to do 2 junior years, so an internship like any other doctor in a civilian hospital, and then a further year in civilian hospitals to get experience. And then I went in 2007 was my first year in uniform. And that year for a doctor is basically an induction year. You bounce around and do a range of courses to basically start to learn to use your medical skill set in a military environment. You do some basic military officer training. You do like a aeromedical evacuation course, some trauma courses, some logistics courses, these kind of things. So that was pretty much my first 12 months in uniform, was doing all that. And so 2008 was the first year that I was a deployable military medical officer. And that was when I got in touch with the selection crew again and said, "Hey, will you let me on the course now?" And they're like, "We'd really rather you waited, but if you really want to, you can apply." So I applied and got on the course that year.
So is that common? Like, does every doctor at the regiment have to come through the selection process?
No. So there's absolutely no requirement, and things have kind of changed a little bit now. It's certainly something that quite a number of support staff across the board, but doctors have done over the years. It's changed a little bit now, and that opportunity may not be there any longer, but certainly there is precedent. So there's and internationally, in terms of certainly the British SAS has had some doctors go through their selection course. I couldn't really talk to the special missions guys over there, but I certainly do know some of them, and they've had some fairly intense kind of forward combat experience. So it's not, and there was doctors that had gone along before me and done selection. There was precedent there. And then certainly by the time I turned up in Afghanistan, there was a number of doctors who had paved the path for a doctor to project forward and get out with the guys. So I wasn't a trailblazer in any way, shape or form there, but it's certainly not necessary to do the role for any of the support staff. And I was just lucky that I went through at a time where they were still supportive of that idea of me doing the course.
Damn. All right. So I want to talk about a little bit about selection, but first I got to read something. I recently interviewed Mark Wales.
And
I said, Mark,
wonderful human being.
I said, I'm gonna interview Dan. What should I ask him? And he goes, "This guy's a legend. You'll love him. Ask him about the fat recruiting officer that laughed at him." I don't want to skip this if timeline wise we've already if we're coming up to it, but what's the story there?
Oh, look, I don't want to. I got to preface this with, this guy's, from all reports, a really good guy. I don't want this to be a slide on this bloke in case he ever happens to listen to this and recognise that he's the guy. But I'd gone in, so this was in 2007, so the year before I did the selection course, and I was fresh in the army. I hadn't even finished all my courses to be a deployable military medical officer. So I'm brand new. I'm green. I'm wet behind the ears. And by that time, although to put context on it, I had in my mind been training towards SAS selection for 6 years by that time. So, that was, from my perspective, that was what I was doing. I was getting close to this opportunity to do selection. But from his perspective, I'm 30 seconds in uniform. I haven't even finished my induction courses. And so I turn up to my career interview. And to be fair, also at that stage, I had got this idea in my head that I might want to do selection and try and hop in the mix as an actual troop commander. So not as a doctor, to jump ship and become a troop commander, because I'd learnt that there'd been a F-18 pilot, so a fast jet pilot, had done just that. A submariner from the Navy had done that. And so I sort of thought, hang on, this might be the new goal. And so I walked into this career interview and this guy was well, I remember him as being kind of portly. Maybe my memory isn't serving me as well. I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I can. But anyway, long story short, I sit down, he asks me what's your plans? What do you want to do? Expecting to hear this progress as an army doctor and maybe do this posting, that posting, become a senior medical officer, all the rest. I sit down and just confidently tell him that I want to do SAS selection, and if I'm able to jump across and be a troop commander. And the bloke was eating his lunch at the time, and he was shocked by that. And his response was he needed to laugh, but he had a mouthful of food, and so he's sucking in air to laugh at me, and he starts choking on his sandwich and has this coughing fit, and then recovers from that and just gives me a ripping. And it was a pretty humiliating moment for me, to be honest. And I came out of that just, well, equal parts gutted at the interaction, but also really motivated. And I know that spite and hate are probably not great things to try and be your primary motivators, but that interaction fueled me for many, many dark times during my training for selection. And as I said, I can see it from this guy's perspective. Yeah. He's got this brand new bloke, hasn't even finished induction training, sitting there spruiking some ridiculous dream. And anyway, it all played out how it did. But from all reports, he's a wonderful bloke and a very competent dude. And yeah, and that was my interpretation of the interaction. Maybe I misinterpreted it. Anyway, that's the story.
Well, thanks for sharing it. I know I can understand the context. So let's jump to one of the dark moments that you just kind of alluded to during selection. In at least the 70 kilogram Dickhead book, you do talk about these. Two of them in particular, but could you talk through one of these moments where, I mean, the selection process for all of these units is legendary. One of these moments where you were right on the edge of quitting and how you kind of pulled through.
Yeah, probably the key one where, and I wasn't on the edge of quitting the course, but I was on the edge of quitting progressing in one particular activity, which might have, I don't know if it would have made a difference or not to my overall outcome, but it would have been about 16 days into the course, I guess. So everyone's pretty sort of stripped back by then. Everyone's pretty broken. And it was the last day of a 5-day individual navigation exercise called Happy Wanderer. So our course gets broken into, you've got this first 12 or so days, 11 or 12 days, which they call it all the usual selection course, but it's designed to just whittle the course down and really see who's there for the right reasons and it might be have the potential attributes. And then they fire you off on this 5-day individual NavX where you bounce around checkpoints and it's the textbook. You don't know how many checkpoints you need to hit. You don't know how many Ks you have to cover. So it's a self-motivating thing. You're out there by yourself, just living in the field. And then you go into the final stage, which is the real crux. That's 5 days of near complete food and sleep deprivation where you just get absolutely thrashed around the clock, and they call that Lucky Dip. And so this was just before Lucky Dip. It was the end of Happy Wanderer, and I was starting to lose a lot of weight by this point. I didn't have much to lose. I ended that course actually 58 kilograms, which I'm not sure in pounds what that'd be, but very, very, very light. For perspective, I finished high school 67 kilos as a 17-year-old. So I was a shadow of my former self. But it was on the last day of that course, I'd done 4 of these peaks, like it was in a national park and we were up and down mountains. I'd covered about 110 kilometers. There was rumors that you had to cover 120 to 150 and you had to get up 5 mountains. And I was starting to get a bit ground down psychologically, and we weren't allowed to move after dark, which was the other thing. There was no move during the period of darkness. So I was approaching what was my final checkpoint right as the sun was setting. The final checkpoint was on the top of a peak that I was walking up to the base of this mountain, and I'm looking at it, the sun's falling. I knew that I'd only hit 4 peaks. It was rumored that you had to hit 5. No one knew for sure. I knew I was sitting on about 110 to 115 kilometers. So I was on the lower end of what might have been acceptable. And I was just defeated. I was just mentally defeated. I was walking up to this thing thinking, I'm not going to get up that before dark. I'm just going to camp at the bottom of it. And if they kick me off, they kick me off type thing. It was sort of that I was really down at that point. It was a low point. And at that stage, another candidate actually had the same checkpoint as his final one. I hadn't noticed him, but he charged up behind me and came level with me and scared crap out of me, actually. I was in my own little sort of self-defeatist world. But he was so positive. I'm like, oh man, what do you reckon? We can't get up this thing by dark, can we? And he's like, nah, no way, but I'm going for it anyway. I'm like, yeah, why? And he's like, well, Jesus, I mean, this is another peak. I've got to get this peak. And he was so positive. And so we get to the base of the climb. He charges up it. I go in a different direction and sit down on my pack thinking I'm done. And I'm watching this bloke power up this hill. And it was at that point I sort of did a bit of soul searching. I thought, you know what? I've put 7 years into this. This might be the difference between me finishing this course and getting selected and not. And here I am. The mountain's right there. And so I sort of had this moment of, I got to get up. And I started kicking myself. I'd burned about 15 minutes sitting there feeling sorry for myself, and packed my stuff up and just charged up this hill. And it was a real frenzy. I was in the zone. I was pouring sweat. My heart's going a million miles an hour. My lungs and legs are screaming at me. But just belting up this path. It was well after dark. I get to the top and check in. And so it was sort of a real pivotal moment for me. It was after that I thought, I'm not quitting here. There's no way I'm quitting. It was and a lot of it was because of that other candidate. Just his attitude just changed mine in that moment, and checked in, got through the activity, went on to Lucky Dip, finished, got picked up. But yeah, that was probably the lowest ebb on selection.
When you went into the course, were the instructors like, this guy's a doctor, what the hell is he doing here? Like, do they even know that you're a doctor? Or is everybody like, you're stripped down? They don't know who's an officer, who's a soldier, who's support?
Some of the head Carter staff knew. So I mean, they know who you are, but the average DS on a stand didn't know one from the other. They could differentiate officers from other ranks because of the officers were numbered from kind of one upwards, and then it picked up on the ORs. So the lower numbers were the officers, and then there's a period where you strip into, you break the course down, and the officers do an officer module, and the ORs go and do something, do their module. And so they know, that you're an officer, but no, a lot of them didn't have any idea that I was a doctor. During the officer course, officer component, they did, and they took that into context with things like the quick decision exercises or the military appreciation process, the operational planning. They took all that into consideration, that I didn't have the same background, thankfully. But no, for the most part, when you're out on a stand, they didn't know one officer from the next.
Wow. Okay. So you get through selection, then you go to your first unit. What's it like coming in as a doctor to that unit when there's a part of you that's interested in being a troop commander or like being a door kicker? How do they embrace a doctor coming in that environment?
Oh, it was kind of a little bit of a novelty, I guess. Like I think it gave me a degree of credibility that wasn't
For sure
expected of that role or necessary of that role. And so and what had happened at the end of, so I was I'd finished up all those induction courses at the end of 2007. I'd posted to an infantry battalion. So I was with an infantry battalion as their doctor. And then I'd gone midway through that year and done selection. And what would normally happen after selection is you'd stay on and do your reinforcement cycle, so your continuation training, and then go into the SAS regiment. What ended up happening with me, and I knew this ahead of time, was that our infantry battalion was deploying to East Timor-Leste, and the commanding officer had said to me before I went on selection, he's like, "Yep, I support you going on selection. I'll sign off on it. But if we can't replace you can't replace the doctor for our tour of Timor, you got to come back. I'm going to call you back." And that's what ended up happening. So I finished selection, and then very early after selection, I got called back to my infantry unit to deploy to Timor, which was, it was pretty devastating at the time, but it was what it was. And the commanding officer was a brilliant bloke. He is a brilliant bloke, and he was very entitled to say, "No, you're not going to do selection. You're my doc. I need you for this trip. I need you here." But he didn't do that. He let me go. And so I ended up going back and actually needed some surgery on my knee in between getting off selection and deploying with the other element. But to get back to the infantry battalion, having been on SAS selection and being successful on it was fantastic. It just, I think, gave me an in to the infantry soldiers that I might not have otherwise had. And then I had a bunch of brilliant blokes surrounding me at that unit. And particularly when we were in Timor, I was able to plug into a sniper course that was running over there and a recon patrol commander course. And so just tag along and do all this fantastic training. And I think because they recognise, hey, this guy's keen, he's gone and done that course. That's kind of cool. Let's have him along and train him up a bit. And so it opened a lot of doors that I think wouldn't have been otherwise opened.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So when you get back to SAS finally, and you deploy, can you take us through what is your kind of role in that first deployment? And I know we have many when you go to Afghanistan, but that first one, were you leading a team of medics? What's your position there?
Yeah, so just to back up there, so I didn't actually go straight back to the SAS regiment. I got posted initially into Special Operations Command with the 2nd Commando Regiment was the unit that, well, they were what's called the 4th Battalion at the time, but special elements. And so I didn't go back to straight back to SASR. I went to this Commando Regiment, and so I plugged in with them as their doctor and started for about the first 6 months of that when I'd done the induction for Special Operations on the Tactical Assault Group, so the counter-terrorist as the doctor in support of the counter-terrorist. And then it was about midway through that year that I got the first opportunity to deploy to Afghanistan with the Special Operations task group, it was a task group level asset. So it didn't belong to any particular forward element. It wasn't assigned to the SAS or the commandos when we were there. It just was a plug and play wherever it was required in that. And this was another area where I'd come from this commando regiment. It was where I was posted against. And so that's the group that I'd done my pre-mission training with and all the mission rehearsal exercises. And once again, the company commander for that company that I deployed with, he was actually a mate of my brother's back in the day, and he loved the fact that I'd gone and done selection. And so he really advocated being fantastic. And so I got involved in all the mission rehearsal exercises, pre-mission training. The operators got a bit of a look at me and could see that I was pseudo tactically competent and probably someone that they'd tolerate out in the field. And so it once again gave me this opportunity to then prove myself, a little bit of credibility. So when I deployed, it allowed me to get out and about on the ground as a doctor. But it was my role in Afghanistan was that task group level asset that did run the medical capability for the task group. So there was a group of medics that worked with me out of the little regimental aid post on our base in Tarankout. And so there was, I think, 3 that were in there with me. And then there was the integral platoon and troop medics with the commando and the SAS regiment respectively. And so they lived and operated with their forward elements, but they were under my technical chain of command. So when they needed sort of medical oversight, that was me. And so, yeah, that was the structure.
So you're obviously responsible for the aid station and what's going on there and some of the folks who are manning it, but you also somehow find yourself out on missions. Is that right? In this first deployment?
Yeah. So it was really, I mean, straight away, we got there, we settled in, and then, as I said, that commando company commander was advocated for me to be included in a bunch of particularly the commando missions. Not so much that, I mean, the commando element, the SAS element had slightly different mission profiles. And so it was more on that tour, more appropriate, and all the tours really for me to go out with the commando element. It didn't make a lot of sense to plug me onto a team going out to do reconnaissance or do a very low signature move. But if you're going out as a platoon or perhaps a company strength, and you're going out to fight, you're going out to pick a fight, it makes sense to take your doc then. And so ended up getting out on a bunch of missions in all my rotations, but from the very get-go.
So for that first deployment, can you talk me through the first time you go outside the wire for one of these patrols, some combat operation? I mean, can't even believe they're bringing a doc on the mission. It just seems like such a scarce resource you'd want to preserve, but I could see it like you want to have the best medical care possible on the front line. Why not? But what was it like for you after all these years of trying to get there? You're finally there. They're letting you're going outside the wire. Can you put us there? What was that mission like?
Yeah, it was kind of it was the fulfillment of that dream. It was like, I was so excited, privileged, felt like it was, from a self-esteem perspective, I'm like, yeah, this is what I've worked so hard for. This is happening. And also from a naive perspective, I was just, jumping out of my skin with excitement. It was the best. And on that very first mission, for whatever reason, someone thought it would be smart to put me as the gunner in the turret on the back of an armored car. So as the doctor, I'm standing there on this Mag 58 machine gun in the back of the car, and we were driving through the night to a target that we were going to hit on first light. And I remember just naively thinking that anyone you saw would be enemy. We're outside the wire in a war zone. Everyone's going to be enemy. And so, and people are wandering around in Afghanistan, in the middle of the dark all night. That none of them are enemy, but everyone we saw, I remember just, looking through my night vision and seeing someone and then lasing them with this Mag 58, waiting for them to do something. And so there was this sort of anyway, we drove through the night and we started to infill. So we parked however many kilometres off and we infilled to hit this target compound on first light. And just as we were approaching, we got compromised. And we didn't end up in a gunfight straight away, but the ICOM, so their radio chatter, started going nuts, and as it does. And I remember being just behind this feature as we were just getting ready to get in and hit this target, and getting the feedback from the interpreter that we know they're there, that they're prepping for us to come. And I was just so excited. I'm like, oh, this is go time. It's going to be on. And of course it wasn't. We went in, hit this target. There was a couple of shots fired, and the enemy fled. And actually, I reckon we got one of your wonderful machines overhead to go and sort out a Hilux full of enemy, and the Apache dispatched them, and there was a bit of gunfighting. But there was one opportunity where the element that I was attached to had engaged a couple of enemy and were wanting to follow them up. And the bloke running that element was really hesitant, and he didn't come out and say it, but I suspect it was because I was with them, and he was thinking, oh, we really should go after these guys, but if I get the dot killed, I'm going to be in all sorts of trouble. And so I remember thinking, I felt terrible. I felt, oh, this sucks. I don't want to be holding people back. And the other part of it was I wanted to be involved. I wanted to know what that was like. I wanted to get rounds down range in my first mission. Hugely exciting. And yeah, not anticlimactic, but it was a bit of it wasn't with hindsight compared to others down the track, it certainly wasn't a big gunfight by any stretch.
Almost nobody I talk to has their first time outside the wire be some shootout. There's one guy who I interviewed who was in Black Hawk Down. That was his first in Delta. Wow. That was the first time he was like in combat. But for most people, myself included, it's usually like a pretty quiet experience, but you're so amped up because you've been ready for this for so long. As a kid, you're thinking about it, and then all of a sudden it's here. So yeah, I can relate. You mentioned before we started filming that there was one instance, I think on this first deployment, where you go to pull the trigger, you get one round off, and then you get a jam or something happens to this effect. What happened there?
I'd waited that whole tour to get involved, and we'd done a bit of fighting. I'd been in a couple of, and actually about mid-tour, we got it. Actually, if you don't mind, I'll back up and
please,
tell you, because this was the first time that I got shot at accurately, and this was another one of those sort of firsts that you'll never forget. And we'd been tasked to go down if I'm remembering correctly, a British Special Forces element had been into a particular village in southern Afghanistan and down in Helmand province, and they'd got a bit tailed up. They were a bit outgunned, and they'd had a helicopter shot down. A Chinook got shot down. I don't know, it was insertion or extraction, but long story short, they'd lost a couple of pretty key items out of this Chinook, and we knew they were in this particular village. And we got tasked, the Australian Special Operations Task Group got tasked to go and recover them. And so this was the context of the job. We'd inserted, once again, middle of the night, about 20 Ks out, stomped in, hit this target on first light, and it was on. That was the first time I'd been involved in actual proper combat experience. But being a part of the tactical headquarters element, of course, they never deliberately project us to be in a frontline type fight. It doesn't make any sense to have us sort of leading the charge. And so we were slightly offset, close enough to react, but slightly offset to the main fighting element, clearing this village, trying to recover these items. And through that day, we were engaging a little bit from our compound. I wasn't getting any rounds down range, but I was wandering around. It was an old kind of disused mud brick compound, no walls on it, just no roof on it, just the walls. And it was obviously the village's public toilet, because it would just had human excrement everywhere. And there was someone sort of wandering around behind our compound, and we thought he might be a spotter, and I was in a position to get a bit of a look at him. So I'd stood up to walk along a wall to see this guy, and in doing so unknowingly exposed myself from the other side of this compound through a little opening. And anyway, it got a very, very accurate shot that snapped maybe a foot over my head and just smashed into the mud brick next to me. And it was the first time that someone had tried to kill me. And so I hit the deck just in a pile of human shit and lay there and just found myself giggling. My initial response was just, whoa, that was close, and this is awesome. And it was just, I was like a school kid. It was the magnitude of it did not register on any level. I just thought it was cool, and sort of lay there for a bit, and then got up and bolted to a bit of cover. And we ended up drawing that kind of exposed us to the enemy as being in that compound. And so we copped a couple of RPGs and a bit of heavy fire. We were safe ish. But it was that just this overwhelming exhilaration and excitement. It was a hugely positive experience, just a massive dopamine dump. And so that was I didn't get any rounds downrange on that gig. And so, and we recovered these items. And so it was a successful mission. We didn't have any casualties that day. Once again, your guys were overhead providing a stack of support. And so it was a really exciting mission. And, but still, the magnitude of it all didn't really sink in, and all I wanted to do was get some rounds down range. And so it was on the very last mission of that rotation. So been in country maybe 5-6 months. I can't remember how long that tour was, and once again, I was on the back gun in an armored vehicle. We'd cleared a target, and we were extracting and just regrouping, coming back together to roll back to our base. And it's in that context, we had 3 or 4 armored vehicles. So we had a bunch of snipers on their quad bikes and a couple of these long-range patrol vehicles, all gunned up. We'd finished this job. We were just regrouping to bug out. And a few Talibs in a pretty flimsy fighting pit decided to initiate on us. And so there were a handful of blokes with AK-47s. And so these guys arc up, and this is our last mission. We didn't want to take our ammo home. And so these guys just got pulverized, and every sort of major piece of armament was just honed in on this fighting pit, just hosing it. And I was stuck on the back gun pointing in the wrong direction for this. And we had a 40 mil automatic grenade launcher on the front. The bloke on the 40 mil's just going nuts on this fighting position. And I'm stuck looking in the wrong direction. And when he was reloading, I got on the comms and I said, "Can you swing this car around so I can have a ping?" And the driver does. He does this mad 3-pointer. I line up this target, I get it in sights, and I pull that trigger hard just to release a full belt of ammo into this thing. And I get a fucking first round stoppage. I get a single round out of this machine gun, and then it jams. And so I'm frantically trying to clear this thing and get back in the game. Not that it would have made any difference. I think the enemy was probably well and truly dealt with by then. But as I'm trying to clear this gun, my mate on the 40 mil gets that thing reloaded. The car swings back around and he re-engages. So I got a single Mag 58 round down range on my first special operations tour, and that was it.
Oh. So I just want to jump to something that you mentioned, because I know we'll get to later on that you end up dealing with what a lot of people do with post-traumatic stress. You described that first encounter with accurately being shot at as a positive experience, big dopamine drop, like everybody relates to that. Is there any recognition at the time that like this might be the start of what's going to become PTSD for you? Maybe you don't notice it at the time, even in retrospect. Do you think that it was separate from that event?
Yeah, never. That none of that cumulative, and that first tour for me, there is no negative memories from that first tour at all. It was overwhelmingly positive. Our task group was remarkably, I don't like the word lucky, but fate was kind to us on that tour. We didn't lose anyone. No one was killed. And we got in, a bunch of people had really close calls. There was a bunch of people that had, the pistols blown off their hip and had bullet holes in their equipment or in their clothing. We had a couple of guys shot, but not badly, through and throughs to limbs and that kind of stuff. So it was sort of, I'd come away from, and that was my first experience on combat operations. And I'd come away from it thinking, this is great. It's all care, no responsibility. It's good fun. It's exciting. There's enough risk for it to be exhilarating, but no one gets hurt. No helicopters crashed, nothing. And so I got this false impression, and an overwhelmingly positive one. It was hugely exciting. It was hugely rewarding. I got to treat a bunch of combat casualties outside of our task group. So I got to apply this medical skill set, got to treat blast and gunshot wounds in things like the American Forward Surgical Teams, do shifts on the aeromedical evacuation helicopters, so do some forward AME. So it was all overwhelmingly positive. It was just, I could not wait to get back to Afghanistan and do it all again. I wanted more. So there is no trauma associated with that first tour. It was the best experience of my life to that day.
Wow.
2 and 3 where things changed and our luck ran out, if you like, and so that was, with hindsight, where the trauma started to accumulate, but still did not register until years and years later.
Yeah. So let's fast forward then to that second deployment. You're going back with a different unit, same place?
So by that time, I had gotten back to the SAS regiment. So I'd finished up at 2nd Commando Regiment. I'd posted back to the SAS regiment, and then pretty much straight after I posted in, deployed back to Afghanistan. So this was 2011. Went back to Afghanistan for another, and so same role. So it was the role as the regimental medical officer for the special operations landscape. There was a lot more of the we had a lot more aviation support, so we could project out and do air mobile operations, as opposed to most of our first tour we were vehicle mounted. There was some aviation support, was a bit harder to get. The DEA fast teams were in country, and so we started to link up with fast and do some combined targeting, that nexus targeting, that kind of the counter narcotic operations, which were often very kinetic. And we were doing a lot more down in Helmand province by the fact that we had the helicopter capability, so we could project, and the Marines were kicking around with their V-22s and 58s, and so we could really reach out and touch people. And so it was a far more kinetic tour, that one.
And you allude to the fact that things get a little darker starting on this deployment. Can you talk us through maybe one of the missions that comes to mind that was more challenging or really pushed you there?
Yeah, look, there was a real turning point. I've spoken to this in other podcasts and other areas, but it was a mission that we'd done into Helmand. It was basically the Taliban had control over this particular village. The US Marines had pushed in and tried to clear it, but been repelled a couple of times. And they knew it was a real enemy hub where they were kind of consolidating and reinforcing and training out of. And so we got tasked to roll in there and just try and, from my impression, we were just trying to soften the target up a little bit rather than clear it, to allow the Marines to then come in. So my understanding of our mission was to go in and basically start a fight, deplete the enemy, reduce their numbers as best we could, and at least deplete their capability to fight, their ammunition supply. So we knew we were going in there for hard fighting, and we'd inserted in the middle of the night, and this was April, so that we'd been in country and we'd done a fair bit of fighting at that point, but we knew this was going to be a decent sort of gunfight, and indeed it was. The 160th actually put us in, and on this occasion we decided we'd land right next back into this village, and so rather than insert a million miles out and try and walk in, we thought we'd just land right next to them and race in as best we could. And so the 160th put us in within a couple hundred meters, middle of the night, and we got off quick and they got out of there quick, as they do. Very very efficient. You'd attest to this as more than most, but awesome capability to have in support. And so we get off these helos, we race in within about maybe 20 seconds of us just pouring into the insertion site, just this red trace just ripping over us, and pretty soon after that we started getting RPGs, airburst, and so we're bolting to the edge of this village and starting to try and make our way to our designated compounds of interest to set up and get established, and so it was on from the very start, and we managed to get in there unscathed. There was a couple of close calls that night, but no one got hit. Got into our compounds. There was a bit of a lull sort of between maybe 3 and 5 a.m. and then first light, as was the tendency, it was on again. So massive day of fighting, gunships overhead and drones on station and fighting all day. That night, so we didn't take any casualties that day. We had a pretty good day. It was, once again, close calls, but overnight we'd actually pretty much run dry of most of our certainly heavy weapons, the shoulder fired stuff, and ammo was running low. We were a bit low on water. It was hot, middle of summer in Afghanistan, so we got a resupply that night. Got a Hercules come in and kicked out a pallet of ammo and water, and resupplied during that lull in the period of darkness. And then the following morning, the enemy had overnight reinforced. We had realised that we'd bitten off a fair bit here, and we were maybe choking on it a little. We'd kicked a hornet's nest, and so we had a commando platoon in armoured vehicles on a different mission, but not far from us, and we'd got them to drive through the night to form a bit of a perimeter on one side of us. So we were in the middle of this village. We were surrounded by enemy, which sounds far more dramatic than it actually is, but we were getting attacked from all angles. And then we had this semicircle of armoured vehicles on the outside of that, fighting in. And so that was how the stage was set for the second day of fighting. And it was on that second day that the fighting really intensified, and we started to take some casualties. We had a couple of guys who were trying to clear a compound, and they got fragged by a grenade, and one of them took some shrapnel through an arm, and the other took some through in the side of his chest around his plates in his vest. And so I treated those guys. Thankfully, they weren't too bad. A guy got a big chunk taken out of the front of his shin from a rocket. And another guy had a plate strike. He was all right. But so it started to, become pretty real. And it was early in that afternoon that there was a particular compound series where there was a series of machine gun posts set up, and we were copping heavy fire. It was really hindering our ability to influence the situation. And one of our guys, a commando by the name of Brett Wood, who was an absolute warrior he was leading a compound series to try and clear those machine gun posts. And he, unfortunately, as the lead man in this element, struck a big improvised explosive device. And I was in a compound about 150 metres, I reckon, back from there. And the whole compound rocked. It was a big device. And it was a bit eerie in that the entire village went quiet. The gunfight stopped. Everything went dead quiet. There was this massive blast, this huge plume of dust and smoke, and everything went silent. Then everything resumed, and the radios came to life with trying to get information. And I started to grab my med kit. I'd been up on the roof shooting through a little keyhole there, trying to sort of suppress this enemy position with another guy. And I raced down, got my kit on, waited for the call, and sure enough, got this call through that we had some critically injured casualties. And so formed up with a quick reaction force, moved forward. The first responders were other members of this clearance team that were right there when the blast went off. One of them had been pretty badly hit, but the other two, who were a bit further back, they'd just hit the blast wave had hit them. They hadn't been trapped, and they were still, really messed up. Had blown eardrums and had copped a big blast, but they had responded and dragged the first casualty back into the nearest safest compound, and then had gone back and recovered Brett, who'd initiated the device, and he was horribly damaged. And they did the initial management of him, putting on the arterial tourniquets and managing him, did a spectacular job of it. We moved forward with a quick reaction force led by another incredible warrior by the name of Todd Langley, who sadly was killed in action about 6 weeks after this event. And I sort of responded to him as well, but there was nothing that could be done. And so we went into this compound, and Brett was hanging by a thread. And despite our best efforts, we got beaten by the injuries there. And in that, we'd been dislocated, so we'd moved forward. It was the light was starting to fail. There'd been an aeromedical evacuation helicopter called. They were flying circuits just off target, and they were starting to give us the call that they were running a bit low on fuel. We had these three other blokes that were pretty badly damaged. The enemy knew we were dislocated and we were bogged down with casualties, and they were coming in on us, and so we had roof teams up, and they were pretty close quarters engaging these enemy trying to get in on us. So it was quite a complex situation, and the engineers actually had come and cleared the very path that we had walked down, or run down as it was. And I remember before we ran down there, Todd Langley, this lead man, he turns to us and he says, "Hey, watch your feet here, stick to the hard packed dirt. This looks dodgy," was his words, or something to that effect. He recognized that this was probably laced with IEDs. And so I just rigidly stepped where the operator in front of me stepped, and the engineers had come along while we were responding to the casualties, and they'd swept that alleyway, and there were 3 other IEDs in that alleyway. And so, I mean, Todd had the presence of mind to say, "This looks dodgy," and then just charged straight down it. I mean, it was the caliber of blokes that I was working with, and so they'd cleared that. We extracted and ended up, fighting into the evening, and then the 160th came. We stomped out. 160th picked us up about 10 k's out of town that night, but that was the first time where it registered. What we're playing for keeps here. This game's real, and this has nothing to do with skill. This was one of our best operators in the commando company, and he'd been killed, and it's like this game's real. It's on. And the other thing was it occurred to me that it's on me. There's no one else there in terms of I can't defer to a higher medical authority there. It's me, and I gotta do what I can do. I need to be at the top of my game, and so there was a couple of things that changed with that event, and then sadly in pretty quick succession we lost another 2 guys, Todd Langley being one, and then one of our engineers called Ryan Robinson, who was hit shortly after that as well on a different mission that we were doing with the DEA. And same, I responded to him and couldn't save him. And so it was a period of time of a couple of months where everything changed. It all became very, very real, very, very quickly.
So I would imagine when you were doing your medical training, the 3 years you had after medical school and you were interning and working in hospitals, were you working trauma rooms as well?
A bit. I tried to stack my experience to be emergency.
Yeah.
But the reality is in Australia, we've got very different gun regulations, as I'm sure most listeners are aware, and we don't see a lot of gunshot wounds. Certainly not high velocity gunshot wounds. There's just not the same access to the rifles that would cause those injuries, and they're just not used. So I didn't have a lot of exposure to that. That said, in the Special Forces medical training continuum, there's a couple of a bunch of really just fantastic human beings that are cardiothoracic surgeons, vascular surgeons, anaesthetists, emergency physicians that run a whole bunch of the training, really high fidelity, super realistic training that is a great stress inoculation and does empower you with a lot of skills to be able to operate in that environment. So we had that training, but not in the civilian medical system.
Yeah. So you'd certainly been around trauma, but maybe not that type. And these are people you've trained with, been very close with, and there's no one else. To your point, you couldn't defer to like, hey, I'm at the hospital, I can go get this very seasoned doctor to give me a second opinion. It was all on you. Damn.
And that was the other key factor. I'd been around, death plenty of times prior to that, and traumatic deaths, but it was always a stranger. There's someone that gets rolled into the ED. You don't know who they are. There's no emotional attachment there, and also you're part of a team. And when I was working in ED as a junior doc, you're the junior guy. You get the shitty jobs, or you get put in the corner to watch while the grown-ups manage the trauma. And then all of a sudden it's on me, it's my mates. And it was a whole different ball game.
I will say I had an experience before I deployed, but I was in a unit as a junior lieutenant, and we went out for a gunnery exercise. And one of the really strong pilots in our unit was flying, and he flew straight into the ground, like just. Yeah. And it was a realization, the way you said, like this guy was very proficient. So the fact that could happen to him really registered with me. Like, this is not a joke anymore. Like there's a lot of it, not just luck, but you got to be on your game all the time. And even then you could still run into problems. So yeah, I can relate to that. Damn. Okay. I know this is a tough deployment. It sounds like you lose a couple more guys during this. And we agreed beforehand we would stop at this deployment and then pick up for deployments 3 and 4 for part 2. And I'm sure I will get some hate mail for stopping here. But I think we had discussed it offline. It sounds like it's an important point. You're kind of at an inflection point where this stuff is becoming real and it's changing the way you think about this career that you're in, right?
Yeah, look, absolutely. It was pivotal. And the other thing that was going on in the background there was I was married, and we had one young son. So he was yet to turn 1 when I went and did SAS selection, but so he was a little infant when I went on my first trip, and then just before my second trip, we'd had our second son, and then things got real on that second trip. So in the background was I've all of a sudden, I'm not a single bloke anymore. This thing's bigger than me, and the realization that we were playing for keeps, and also this sensation of it being a fairly selfish thing that I was doing here in a lot of ways. And because I loved it, I was really drawn to it, and it was fulfilling something for me, but that was stacking up in the background as well, thinking, well, if I get killed or seriously injured here, it's not just my life that's impacted. I've got this young family here. And so, yeah, for those reasons as well, things became more and more real.
Wow. Okay. So I will say for folks who are going to be listening to round 2, you have time to go read this book, Average 70 Kilogram Dickhead, because we're going to be talking a lot about that when we come back next time. We'll also talk a little bit about Resilient Shield, right? Which is the new book that's coming out. It has come out where you are. And we'll touch on that as well. And I know there's a website that people can find there. We'll have all the links in this episode so people can get read up for the second round. Excellent. If that sounds good to you.
Sounds great.
Thanks so much, Dan, for the time. I'm really looking forward to round 2.
Me too, Ryan. It's a pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for listening to this combat story. As we wrap up, I just wanted to say thank you to those in the combat story community who have taken a few minutes out of your busy lives to not just listen to these stories, but also leave positive and supportive comments on Apple and YouTube. Here are some of the comments that caught my eye this week. This first comment comes from John, who left this on our video with Barry Strauss talking about Brasidas, the Spartan warrior. John says, "Where did you find this guy? Both a genius and a master storyteller. Well done, Ryan." I know that this particular episode was a little controversial within the combat story community. Some just want to hear the modern day veterans. There is a part of me, though, that really loves hearing these stories of the ancient warriors. So I appreciate this comment, and you're right, Barry Strauss is just a great speaker, I think, and storyteller, especially when it's combined with this rich history. So I was saying in my description for that video, I wish that we had somebody like him when I was taking classes, because it's fascinating to hear. So thanks for leaving that note, John. I appreciate it. The second comment is from another YouTube video left by Connor. "Hey Ryan, massive fan. It would be great to see more Australian Special Forces. I have 2 friends of mine that have dads that were previously in the Australian SASR. If you would like, I can put you in contact." I will say, Connor, I'll take you up on that offer. Please do send it. But I would also say, ask and you shall receive. I hope you're hearing this particular comment read out at the end of our interview with Dan Pronk, who, as we all know, is an incredibly gifted person and former Australian SAS officer and doctor, which is crazy. But we also have another one scheduled for next month with a real legend that I think you are going to enjoy. So I'm really looking forward to it. I'll keep you waiting until then, but really thank you for the note, Connor, and please do send me those names if you have somebody that you think would be appropriate for the show.